Have you ever wondered why settlers in the Wild West feared the night more than wild animals or armed raiders? When the sun disappeared behind the horizon and the temperature outside dropped to -40 degrees, their own homes turned into ice traps. They had to fight the cold with straw, old skins, and the warmth of their own bodies as their only weapons. The greatest danger awaited them not in the forest, but in their own beds, where sleep could imperceptibly turn into eternal freezing. Watch the video to the end to find out how ordinary bricks saved the lives of entire families, and why waking up in the morning began with breaking the ice in a bucket of water.
Practical, makeshift, and far from comfortable.
What if I told you that the first bed of a settler was more like a bag of dry grass than a place to rest? Most pioneers arriving in new lands did not have the opportunity to bring furniture or quality mattresses with them. The first task was to create a so-called mattress, which served as the only layer between a person and the cold. It was a huge bag made of coarse fabric that had to be tightly stuffed with any available material. Dry grass, straw after threshing grain, or even corn leaves collected in the fields were used. Every evening, this improvised mattress had to be thoroughly beaten with your hands to give it at least some shape. The straw inside quickly crumpled, turning into a hard and bumpy surface resembling a rocky road. Sleeping on such a bed was a challenge, as the dry stalks constantly poked through the fabric and made a loud crunching sound with every movement. Dust from the dry grass rose into the air, causing sleepers to sneeze and cough throughout the night. But it was this layer of air between the straws that provided the necessary insulation from the icy floor. Once a year, usually after the harvest, the contents of the mattress were completely replaced with fresh ones. This was an important event, as the old straw turned into dust over the course of a year and no longer retained heat. The fresh filling was springy and high, raising the sleeper high above the floor. But this comfort lasted only a few weeks. Gradually, the straw settled, and by the middle of winter, people were again sleeping on practically hard boards. It was necessary to constantly add new portions of grass to at least somehow maintain the volume. Such a mattress had another unpleasant feature. It was very noisy. Every turn of the sleeper was accompanied by a loud rustling sound, which seemed deafening in the silence of the small house. If several people slept in one room, one person turning over would wake everyone else. However, there was no choice, as the alternative was sleeping on the bare ground or boards. Straw was free, accessible, and most importantly, it worked as a heat insulator. Corn leaves were often used for stuffing, as they were considered a softer and more durable material than ordinary grass. They had to be thoroughly dried before use to prevent rotting inside the fabric. Damp stuffing could cause serious lung diseases, so dryness was strictly monitored. The leaves were laid in layers, trying to create an even surface without pits or bumps. But even the best laying did not save from the fact that by morning, everything was piled up in a heap. In some regions where grass was scarce, moss or even thin fir branches were used. Such a bed was incredibly fragrant, filling the house with the smell of a coniferous forest, but it was hard to sleep on. The branches, even covered with thick fabric, dug into the sides, leaving bruises on the body by morning. Nevertheless, it was better than lying on the frozen ground, which sucked all the life out of you. People learned to find a comfortable position, even on such uncomfortable surfaces. The fabric for the mattress itself, or tika, was sewn from the strongest material they could find. Usually it was thick canvas or homespun cloth that could withstand constant friction and pressure. The seams were double-stitched so that the filling would not come out under the weight of a sleeping person. If the fabric tore in the middle of winter, it was a real disaster that required immediate repair. The holes had to be sewn up with thick needles and coarse thread, often without even removing the mattress from the bed. The height of such a bed was critical for survival in winter. The higher a person was from the floor, the warmer the air around them. Therefore, wooden boxes were often placed under the straw mattress, or high bunks were built. The space under the bed was also used wisely, storing chests with belongings there, which created an additional barrier to drafts. It was an entire engineering structure designed to preserve precious heat. On particularly cold nights, old coats or carpets were laid on top of the straw mattress. This helped to smooth out the unevenness of the filling and added another insulating layer. People used everything they had in the house to make their sleeping place a little more comfortable. Comfort was a relative concept, and the main goal was simply to survive until morning. Sleep was not rest, but work to preserve heat. Have you ever slept on a surface that makes noise every time you breathe? Tell us in the comments about the most unusual or uncomfortable place you've ever slept. Ready to learn the secret that divided pioneers into rich and poor based on a single detail of their bedding? While a straw mattress was the basis for survival, a real feather bed was considered the pinnacle of comfort and a status symbol. Gathering enough feathers for one such mattress was a titanic task, sometimes taking several years. Each feather had to be cleaned, dried, and preserved before it could be used. Not only was the feather bed soft, it also had a phenomenal ability to retain body heat. Having geese or ducks on the farm was a prerequisite for creating such a luxurious bed. Feathers were collected when plucking birds for food, but this amount was catastrophically small. Therefore, housewives often resorted to partially plucking live geese during the warm season. This required skill and patience so as not to harm the bird and to obtain valuable down. Only the softest down was used to make the best feather beds, which were passed down from generation to generation. A feather duvet was usually placed on top of a straw mattress, creating a layered insulation system. The straw underneath provided height and protection from drafts from below, while the feathers on top enveloped the sleeper's body. A person literally sank into this cloud, which instantly heated up and maintained its temperature throughout the night. It was like a warm cocoon that you didn't want to leave for the freezing room. The difference between sleeping on straw and feathers was enormous. However, caring for a feather bed was much more difficult than caring for a straw mattress. It had to be fluffed regularly so that the down did not clump together and retained its airiness. It also had to be aired in the sun to get rid of accumulated moisture. If the feathers began to rot inside the dense fabric, the smell became unbearable and the mattress itself became unusable. Washing such a product was practically impossible in frontier conditions. In large families, the availability of a feather bed was often a subject of dispute and strict distribution. Usually, the heads of the family or elderly people whose joints needed warmth slept on the best bed. Young men and workers were more often content with straw or skins. Sometimes the feather bed was given to a sick family member, as it was believed that warmth helped fight fever. It was a resource that was distributed according to need and seniority. A good feather duvet could weigh up to 20 kilograms or more. It was a heavy but pleasant weight that created a feeling of security. The dense fabric, or ticking, was impregnated with wax or soap on the inside to prevent the sharp tips of the feathers from sticking out. If this impregnation was compromised, sleep turned into torture with thousands of tiny needle pricks. The quality of the fabric was as important as the quality of the filling. Interestingly, in some cultures, settlers used the perina not as a mattress, but as a huge blanket. People lay down on straw and covered themselves with a heavy down bag. This created a thermos effect, where body heat did not escape but circulated around the sleeper. This method was especially popular among immigrants from Northern Europe. It allowed them to survive even in homes where the temperature dropped below zero. The value of a feather bed was so high that it was often listed as a separate item in wills. Losing a feather bed in a fire or flood was considered a tragedy comparable to the loss of livestock. When moving to a new place, women took great care of their feather beds, carefully packing them into carts. It was a piece of civilization and comfort that they carried with them to wild lands. Even old and worn-out feather beds were never thrown away. They were re-sewn into pillows or small footrests. Every feather was valuable, and wastefulness was unacceptable in harsh conditions. The leftovers were used to make small bolsters that were placed under doors to reduce drafts. Waste-free use of resources was the basis of life on the frontier. But what if even a feather bed is not enough to keep warm in a freezing house? In the next chapter, you will learn about a method that turned ordinary stones into lifesavers. Want to know the secret that literally saved toes from frostbite right in bed? When the temperature in the house dropped so low that the water in the bucket was covered with a crust of ice, one blanket was not enough. Settlers resorted to actively heating their beds using heat-retaining objects. The most common method was to use heated stones, bricks, or special irons. This evening ritual was an essential part of getting ready for bed during the winter months. Ordinary bricks or flat river stones were placed on the edge of the hearth or in the oven long before bedtime. They had to be thoroughly heated, but not red hot so as not to cause a fire. This process required care, as an overheated stone could burn through bedding or a mattress. The ideal temperature was determined by experience. The stone had to be hot but not burning to the touch through fabric. In the absence of bricks, heavy cast iron irons were used. After heating, the stone was carefully wrapped in several layers of old flannel or woolen fabric. This was done so that the heat would be released gradually over several hours, rather than all at once. The fabric also protected the sleeper's skin from accidental burns during sleep. The wrapped hot water bottle was placed under the blanket at the feet a few minutes before the person went to bed. This created a zone of warmth where blood circulation was weakest. Soapstone or steatite was valued more highly than ordinary bricks because of its unique heat capacity. Slabs made of this material could retain heat almost until morning, providing comfort throughout the night. Families who owned such stones were considered lucky and cherished them like the apple of their eye. Often these stones had wire handles attached for easy carrying. They were passed down from generation to generation and taken along when moving house. Wealthy families used special metal warmers with long handles. Hot coals from the fireplace were poured into a copper container and covered with a lid. This contraption was moved between the sheets, smoothing and warming the bed before bedtime. It was effective, but required great care to prevent sparks from setting the fabric on fire. The smell of slightly burnt fabric often accompanied winter nights. For those who had neither special warmers nor suitable stones, baked potatoes were used. Large tubers were heated in ashes, wrapped in rags and placed in pockets or held in hands under a blanket. Potatoes retained heat well, and in the morning, even though they had cooled down, they could be used for breakfast or feed for livestock. It was a simple and ingenious dual-purpose solution. In extreme cases, bags of heated sand or salt were used. The danger of this method was that tired people could fall asleep with their bare skin touching the hot object. Burns to the feet were a common injury among pioneers in the winter. Men who were tired after hard work and did not feel the heat through their sleep suffered particularly often. Treating such burns in unsanitary and cold conditions was long and difficult. Sometimes, if the family was large, there were not enough heated objects for everyone. Priority was given to the weakest and those who worked outside. The rest had to rely on the warmth of their own bodies and the weight of their blankets. This taught people to share and care for each other at the expense of their own comfort. Heat was a resource that had to be distributed fairly. In the morning, the cooled stones and bricks were returned to the hearth, where they lay all day, waiting for the next night. This cycle of stones was an integral part of winter life. They turned black from soot and time, but continued to perform their important function. A simple piece of stone became the heart of nighttime comfort. This method, primitive as it was the only way to add external heat to a cold bed. Without it, many nights would have been simply unbearable. Would you risk putting a hot brick in your bed for warmth? Like this if you think it's an inventive solution. Guess what weighed more than 20 kilograms and weighed down on sleeping settlers every night? When ordinary wool blankets failed to protect against the bitter cold, people turned to the experience of indigenous peoples and trappers. The use of wild animal skins, especially bison and bear, became the only salvation in extreme cold. A bison skin, or robe, was not just a luxury item, but a necessary tool for survival on the Great Plains. Its thick, curly fur created an impenetrable barrier to the cold air. Bison hides were usually worn with the fur on the inside, against the body, to retain maximum heat. The leather side on the outside acted as a windbreak, preventing drafts from entering the home. However, such blankets were incredibly heavy and stiff, especially if they were poorly tanned. Sleeping under such weight was like being under a press, and turning from side to side was a real physical effort. People often woke up with sore muscles from the weight of their own bedding. Bear skins were valued even more highly because of their length and thickness. One large bear skin could cover an entire bed on which several people slept. Bear fur had water-repellent properties, which was important in damp dugouts. But hunting a bear was a risky business, so such skins were rare and a source of pride for their owners. They often served as a rug during the day and as the main blanket at night. The skins had another significant drawback: a specific smell. Wet skin, animal fat, and smoke from the hearth, which permeated the fur, created a heavy aroma. Over time, people got used to this smell, and it began to be associated with warmth and safety. But for an unaccustomed person, spending the night under an old bison's skin could be a test for the sense of smell. Airing them out in the cold only helped to a certain extent. In addition to large skins, smaller ones were also used, sewing them into large blankets. Wolf, fox, and even coyote skins were used when there was no other choice. Such a patchwork fur blanket required great skill on the part of the seamstress, as the skin had to be sewn together with strong sinews. These products were less warm than a whole bison hide, but still better than fabric blankets. Every piece of fur was used to combat the cold. The skins required special care to prevent them from stiffening and cracking due to temperature changes. They had to be regularly kneaded and greased, which was a laborious process. If the skin got wet, it could not be dried close to the fire. Otherwise, it would shrink and become stiff as plywood. Drying took days, during which the family was deprived of their main source of heat. The weight of the hides also had a positive effect. It held the blankets in place, preventing them from sliding off at night. No matter how much a person tossed and turned, the heavy bison robe held all the lower layers securely to the bed. This created an airtight capsule from which heat could not escape. The feeling of pressure became synonymous with warmth. Often the hides were used not only as blankets, but also as mattress pads. Lying on thick fur was much warmer than on the cold teak of the mattress. This created a sandwich of fur with the person inside. This design made it possible to survive even nights when the fire in the hearth was completely extinguished. Over time, with the disappearance of bison, such skins became scarce and were replaced by heavy quilted blankets. But the old settlers always remembered the warmth of a real bison robe with nostalgia. No wool could compare to the primitive warmth provided by animal skins. It was protection gifted by nature itself. But even the warmest hides could not save you if the house itself was against you. In the next chapter, you will learn why it sometimes snowed inside the house, even when the windows were closed. Many people imagine pioneer homes as cozy wooden cabins with cheerfully crackling fireplaces. The reality, especially on treeless plains, was much harsher and dirtier. Most of the first dwellings were sod houses, literally made of pieces of earth with grass. These dugouts were damp, dark, and never completely dry. The earthen walls kept the cool in the summer, but in the winter they turned into an icy crypt. The main problem with such houses was their lack of airtightness. When a blizzard raged outside, strong winds drove fine snow dust into every crack, even the most microscopic ones. People woke up in the morning to find small snowdrifts on their windowsills, on the floor, and even on top of their blankets. This phenomenon was called snow pollen, and it was almost impossible to combat. People had to cover their faces with cloth so as not to inhale the icy dust while they slept. Wooden log houses, although considered more prestigious, also had their problems. The wood dried out and warped in the cold, and cracks appeared between the logs. The moss or clay caulking dried out over time and fell out, opening the way for the wind. The walls in such houses often froze through, becoming covered with frost on the inside. This frost melted when the stove was lit, and water ran down the walls, creating dampness and mold. The floor in most houses was earthen, packed down to the hardness of stone. In winter, it became the main source of cold, drawing heat from the feet in the entire room. Even when the stove was lit, the temperature at floor level could be below freezing. Therefore, beds were raised as high as possible, and straw, skins, or woven mats were laid on the floor. Walking barefoot on such a floor was unthinkable. Windows were another weak point in the defense against the cold. Glass was expensive and a rare luxury, so window openings were often covered with oiled paper or cloth. These materials let in a little light, but did not retain heat at all. The wind rattled such frames, creating constant noise and drafts. Those who had glass found a thick layer of ice on it in the morning, which had to be chipped away with a knife. The door often opened directly onto the street without any vestibules or porches. Every time the door was opened, a huge cloud of heat instantly escaped, replaced by frosty air. Therefore, in winter, people entered and left quickly, trying to do so as rarely as possible. The gaps under the door were plugged with old rags, which often froze to the threshold by morning. The roof in turf houses was also not a reliable protection. Melting snow seeped through layers of earth and branches, dripping dirty water directly onto furniture and beds. To protect against this, a piece of canvas or oilcloth was often stretched over the bed. It was a kind of umbrella inside the house. Sleeping to the sound of dripping water in sub-zero temperatures was a dubious pleasure. In such conditions, it was impossible to keep the house clean. Dust and dirt constantly fell from the ceiling and walls. In winter, people stopped fighting this, resigning themselves to the fact that a house was simply a shelter, not a model of cleanliness. The main thing was to keep warm, not to maintain the beauty of the interior. It was extremely difficult to heat such a space with a single stove or fireplace. The heat was distributed unevenly. It was hot near the fire, but a meter away from it, water would freeze. People literally huddled around the heat source, turning first one side and then the other toward it. Your face is burning, but your back is freezing. This saying accurately described the feeling in such a house. Living in such a house required constant vigilance and work to plug new gaps. It was an endless war against the wind and cold that could never be won. The house was not a fortress, but a sieve that had to be constantly patched up. What if I told you that personal space in winter became an unaffordable luxury, dangerous to life? In the most severe frosts, the concept of privacy disappeared, giving way to the need to survive by sharing warmth. The whole family, regardless of age and gender, often gathered in one room and sometimes in one bed. This was called bundling, or simply sleeping together, and it was the most effective way to keep from freezing to death. The human body is a powerful heat generator, and it would have been a sin not to use this resource. Parents, children, and even guests, if there were any, could sleep in one large bed. The order of sleeping was strict. The smallest and most vulnerable lay in the middle, where it was warmest. Adults and stronger family members lay down at the edges, creating a living barrier against the cold. They slept huddled together, back to back, to minimize heat loss. Any embarrassment was cast aside when the temperature in the room dropped below zero. If travelers or neighbors caught in a blizzard stayed at the house, they were also invited into the communal bed. Refusal would have been considered madness or an insult. In such situations, a chastity board, or simply a pillow made of blankets, was often placed between strangers to maintain propriety. But in fact, warmth was a common good that was shared with everyone. It was a strange, forced rapprochement. Sometimes, if there was not enough room in the bed, a large shared mattress made from all the blankets in the house was laid out on the floor. The whole family would lie down in a row under a huge homemade blanket sewn from several smaller ones. It resembled a seal rookery where everyone kept their neighbor warm. The breath of many people also raised the air temperature in the small room a little. In the morning, a cloud of steam hung over such a rookery. Such crowding had its drawbacks. If one person got sick, everyone got sick. Viruses and colds spread instantly in such a crowded space. One person's cough kept everyone awake. But the risk of getting sick was less frightening than the risk of freezing alone in different corners of the icy house. The choice was obvious. For small children, this sleeping arrangement was a lifesaver. In a single crib, a child could freeze in a matter of hours as their bodies give off little heat. In a communal pile surrounded by adults, they were safe. Parents often checked the temperature of their sleeping children with their feet and hands, covering them if they uncovered themselves. This custom of sleeping together broke down many social barriers of the time. People saw each other in the most unattractive situations, heard snoring and the sounds of sleep. This created a special kind of closeness that only those who had survived winter on the frontier could understand. Shame gave way in the face of mortal danger. Even domestic dogs and cats were often allowed on the bed at the foot. Their warmth also contributed to the common cause, and the animals themselves were happy to shelter from the drafts on the floor. The saying about the night of 3 dogs, a night so cold that you need 3 dogs to keep warm, had a very real basis. The animals were living hot water bottles. In the morning, when it was time to get out of this warm cocoon, the hardest moment came. The first to get up was the one whose turn it was to stoke the stove, while the others waited under the blankets for the slightest warming of the air. This heroic act was appreciated by all members of the Sleepy Bunch. As soon as spring arrived, people happily returned to their separate beds and corners. But the winter experience of surviving together remained in their memories forever. And in the next chapter, we will learn why the pioneers went to bed without taking off their clothes. Changing into pajamas, a familiar ritual of comfort for us, was a luxury for the pioneers of winter that most simply could not afford. In conditions where the night in the house could be only a couple of degrees warmer than the street, exposing the body even for a minute meant exposing oneself to the risk of colds or hypothermia. To undress meant to freeze instantly. Therefore, they slept in what they wore during the day, in underwear, shirts, woolen shirts, and sometimes in outerwear, without taking off their jackets and vests. Night shirts existed, but they were used more as an extra layer than as a separate home fashion. Every extra layer was worth its weight in gold. The basis of the winter wardrobe, including nightwear, was the legendary woolen underwear known as long johns. It fit tightly to the body like a second skin, covering the person from neck to ankles. Thick wool fibers retained heat, and the natural structure of the material wicking moisture away, keeping the skin dry. However, changing such underwear in a freezing room was a real challenge. Therefore, people wore long johns for weeks on end, sometimes for months until the rare bath day arrived. Hygiene took a back seat to survival. Warmth was much more important than cleanliness. The head was the body's radiator, losing up to a third of its heat, so sleeping with your head uncovered was considered madness. Men wore woolen nightcaps with long ends that could be tied under the chin, and women wrapped their heads in warm scarves or shawls. Hair was braided into plaits so that it would not get tangled and absorb moisture from breathing. Only the nose protruded from the surface of the blanket, and even then, only for those who were not afraid of frostbite while sleeping. Wool socks were a must. They were worn in layers, soft, thin ones next to the skin, thick, coarsely knitted ones on top. Feet in contact with the frozen floor were the most vulnerable. If the feet got cold, it was almost impossible to warm up until morning. Some pioneers did not take off their soft shoes at all. For example, moccasins or felt shoes, if they were dry. This provided additional insulation and allowed them to jump up quickly in case of danger, fire, raids, wolves, or the cries of livestock. On harsh nights, people even went to bed in coats or fur jackets. It was uncomfortable and restricted movement, but it provided an important extra layer of protection. Children were wrapped in shawls, raincoats, and blankets, turning them into thick, warm cocoons. Yes, it was difficult to move in such a bundle, but comfort was a luxury that was sacrificed for the sake of survival. In the morning, the clothes were already warm, and it was easier to get out of bed. There was no need to pull on icy sleeves or trouser legs that felt like metal plates. Nightwear in the modern sense was the preserve of wealthy people from large cities who lived in houses with proper heating. On the frontier, the line between day and night clothing was completely blurred. Clothes became armor, and taking off your armor in winter meant letting the cold and death into your home. There was no aesthetics, no fashion, only practicality and bare necessity. People often took their outer clothing to bed with them, even if they did not intend to wear it. Coats were placed over their legs, serving as an extra blanket. Heavy wool served both as insulation and as a weight, keeping the heat under the blanket. In the morning, the coat was already warm, and it was pleasant to put it on right away without shivering from the cold. But sleeping in clothes had its drawbacks. Tight clothing impaired blood circulation, and the wool pricked and irritated the skin. People got used to the constant itching and discomfort, considering it an inevitable part of winter life. Warmth was more important than comfort. This was the unwritten philosophy of all pioneers. Before going to bed, clothes had to be dried by the fire if they were damp from snow or sweat. Going to bed in wet clothes meant almost guaranteed waking up sick or not waking up at all. Therefore, the evening ritual of drying was as important as prayer or dinner. Every item of clothing, every sock, every mitten had to be dry. Sleeping in clothes was not only a way to keep warm, but also a safety measure. Any danger, a fire from a spark from the stove, children's cries, wolves near the cattle pen, required an immediate response. Clothes turned a sleeping person into a person ready for action in a second. It was a nighttime combat readiness that hung over every frontier home. The fire in the hearth was the heart of the home, and if it went out, life in the house came to a standstill with it. Keeping the fire going all night was a critical task on which the temperature in the dwelling depended. However, the wood burned quickly, and a normal load could not burn for 8 to 10 hours of sleep. Therefore, there was a whole science of banking the fire or night watches. Before going to bed, the largest and most knotty log, called the night log, was placed in the hearth. It was buried in ashes and coals so that it would not burn with an open flame, but would smolder slowly, giving off heat. This allowed the coals to be preserved until morning and the flame to be quickly fanned at dawn. The art of proper wood stacking was passed down from father to son. A mistake could lead to the hearth cooling completely by morning. On particularly cold nights when smoldering alone was not enough, night shifts were assigned. Family members took turns waking up every 2 to 3 hours to add wood and check the draft. This disrupted sleep and exhausted people, but it ensured that the temperature did not drop to a critical level. Often, simple alarm clocks were used for this purpose, or people relied on their internal clocks. The person on duty had to not only add wood, but also monitor safety. Sparks from burning logs could fly out of the fireplace and set fire to the wooden floor or carpet. A fire in winter was a death sentence. The family would be left in the cold without shelter or belongings. Therefore, the person who monitored the fire was responsible for the lives of all those sleeping. If the firewood ran out or was damp, it was a disaster. You had to get up in the middle of the night and go to the woodshed, often through a blizzard, to bring back fuel. This trip was dangerous and unpleasant, so people tried to bring in a mountain of firewood in the evening. A supply of dry firewood inside the house was a sign of thrift and foresight. In metal potbelly stoves, the fire burned even faster than in fireplaces, and they cooled down instantly. It was impossible to sleep peacefully with such stoves. They had to be fed constantly. The walls of the stove glowed red hot and then quickly became icy. These temperature swings were exhausting for the body. Sometimes, in order not to get up, special types of fuel were used, such as dried bison or cow dung, kiziak. It burned slowly with an even smoldering heat, ideal for the night. Preparing this fuel was an important summer task for children and women. The smell of this fuel was distinctive, but warmth was more important than aroma. The first thing they did in the morning was to check whether the coals were still alive. If the fire had gone out, rekindling it with numb hands using a flint was a painful task. Matches were expensive and were used sparingly. Losing the fire in the morning meant that breakfast would be delayed and the house would take several hours to warm up. Fire was a living thing that needed care and attention. They talked to it, coaxed it, and feared it. It was their only ally in the fight against the black, icy night outside the walls of their home. The person responsible for the fire often slept worse than anyone else, listening to the crackling of the logs through his sleep. This tension did not let up until spring. Peaceful sleep was only possible in summer. Waking up in a pioneer house in winter was not much like a good morning from a fairy tale. The first thing a person felt when they opened their eyes was the icy air burning their lungs and the frost on their eyelashes. The blanket around the face was often covered with a hard crust of ice from breathing during the night. It took tremendous willpower to crawl out from under the warm pile of furs and blankets in this cold. The most vivid indicator of the cold was the bucket of water standing in the room. By morning, the water in it was so frozen that you had to break the ice with a knife or a poker to wash or fill the kettle with water. The thickness of the ice served as a kind of thermometer, by which they judged how harsh the night had been. Sometimes the water even froze in a mug left on the table next to the bed. Metal objects in the house, door handles, tools, dishes, became dangerous. Touching them with a wet hand could cause the skin to stick to them instantly, freezing. Children were strictly taught not to touch metal in the morning until the house had warmed up. This rule was learned through pain and scraped skin. You had to get dressed at lightning speed. Often, clothes were dragged under the blanket and put on there, in the warmth, writhing like an eel. Putting on icy pants or a shirt on a body heated up by sleep was a shock to the system. Shoes, if they had not been dried the night before, became hard as stone and had to be kneaded or warmed by the fire. Preparing breakfast began with a struggle to light a fire and melt snow or ice if the water supply had run out. Women worked in mittens until the stove began to give off its first warmth. The steam from the food being cooked mixed with the steam from people's breath, creating a thick fog in the kitchen. Visibility in the house could be minimal for the first half hour. The windows, covered with a thick layer of ice patterns, did not let in any light, so mornings were often spent in twilight or by candlelight. Scraping the ice was useless. It grew back in minutes. This icy shell cut the family off from the outside world, creating a feeling of isolation. Only the sound of the wind outside reminded them of reality. Morning hygiene was kept to a minimum. Washing with ice-cold water was a feat that not everyone dared to attempt. Often, people limited themselves to wiping their faces with a damp cloth. They brushed their teeth quickly, shivering from the cold. There was no question of a proper wash until bath day. Going outside to tend to the livestock was the next challenge. Opening the door, a person was hit in the face by the frosty air. It was necessary to quickly check on the animals, which also suffered from the cold. Caring for livestock was often prioritized over personal comfort, as the family's livelihood depended on the animals. Breakfast was eaten quickly before the food got cold. Plates were heated before porridge was served. Otherwise, the food would cool instantly on contact with the cold dishes. Hot coffee or tea was the main source of internal warmth. Only after a hot meal did the body begin to truly wake up. Those morning hours were a daily battle that tempered character. The pioneers did not complain. They accepted it as a given. The ice-cold bucket was simply a fact of life that had to be dealt with in order to start a new day. Among all the ways to combat the cold, the patchwork quilt or quilt held a special place. It was not just bedding, but real textile armor and a chronicle of family history. In conditions of fabric shortage, not a single scrap was thrown away. Scraps of old dresses, shirts, worn-out trousers, everything was put to use. Women sewed these pieces into intricate patterns, creating fabrics of incredible beauty and practicality. The secret of the quilt's warmth lay in its multi-layered construction. Between two layers of patchwork fabric, a filling was laid, carded wool, cotton, or even old rags if nothing else was available. Then all three layers were quilted frequently and finely by hand. Thousands of small stitches created air pockets that retained heat and made the quilt dense and heavy. The weight of such a quilt was considerable, and this was precisely what was valued in winter. The saying, "a heavy quilt means a warm sleep," was an axiom. Often, 3 or 4 such quilted blankets were placed on one bed, creating an impenetrable armor. It was difficult to breathe under such weight, but it was warm. People literally barricaded themselves with blankets. Quilting was a social activity. Women would gather for quilting bees, sewing parties, to quilt a large quilt for one of them. It was an opportunity to socialize, share news, and warm up in company. A quilt made together was considered especially valuable and charged with good energy. Each patch in the quilt had its own story. This is a piece of my mother's wedding dress. And this is from my father's shirt, which he wore when he came to the West. Lying under such a quilt, children learned the history of their family by touch. The quilt preserved the memory of their ancestors and warmed them with its warmth. The patterns on the quilts often had symbolic meaning or indicated the family's origins. The drunkard's path, log cabin, bear's paw. The names of the patterns reflected the realities of frontier life. Dark colors were used for practicality, bright colors for beauty and to bring joy to the eyes in the gray dugout. It was art born out of necessity. Quilts were cherished more than any other item. They were washed rarely and very carefully so as not to damage the filling. In the summer, they were aired out and sprinkled with fragrant herbs to repel moths. A good quilt lasted for decades, passing from parents to children. If there was a fire, the first thing women tried to save was their quilts. So much labor and soul had been put into them that losing them was unthinkable. Often it was the quilts that helped the family survive in the early days after losing their home, serving as both beds and tent walls. Even very old quilts were not thrown away. They were used to cover horses in severe frosts, plug gaps in windows, or as bedding. A quilt served a person from birth to death, and often the deceased was wrapped in it. The quilt was a symbol of the pioneers' resilience. From scattered, useless pieces, they assembled something whole, beautiful, and capable of protecting them from any adversity. It was a metaphor for their life in the new land. The story of the pioneers' nighttime survival is a chronicle of incredible ingenuity and fortitude of the human spirit. Straw mattresses, hot bricks, heavy skins, and sleeping together were not just everyday details, but tools in a deadly battle with nature. Every night was a test, and every morning was a small victory. They proved that the warmth of home is created not only by walls, but also by caring for one another. We often complain about the cold in our apartments or uncomfortable mattresses, forgetting the price our ancestors paid for comfort. Their experience teaches us to appreciate the simple things: a warm blanket, hot water, and a safe roof over our heads. These people didn't just sleep at minus 40 degrees. They lived, loved, and built a future despite the icy hell around them. Which of these ways to keep warm did you find the most extreme or, conversely, the most ingenious? Are you ready to try sleeping with a hot brick, or do you prefer modern heating? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to learn more about the real history of survival in the Wild West.